name is Matthew Cowell, and I'll be presenting our paper on quantifying static and dynamic information in deep neural networks. So, deep spatiotemporal models have been shown to be really amazing at a variety of tasks, right? Like action recognition or video object segmentation. But it's still not clear what the actual representations are learning in order to solve these tasks. And for example, in action recognition, it's been shown in previous work that action recognition models are actually biased towards appearance information as well as the background scene, and many benchmarks are actually solvable from a single static frame, right? And this gives rise to a underlying problem in the field, which is that there's still no good metrics for quantifying static and dynamic information in deep neural networks. And that really is our goal of this paper, right? Is given a model trained for some video understanding task, we want to be able to quantify the static and dynamic information contained in that model. And so we come up with a metric and we show the efficacy of the metric on two different tasks: action recognition and video object segmentation. But for this talk, given the time constraint, I'm going to focus on action recognition, so please come visit the poster after to see the remaining results. But before I go into the approach, I want to actually define what do I mean when I say static and dynamic. So when I say static, what I'm talking about is information that's recoverable from single static frames, like photometric properties, or textures, or the background of a scene. When I talk about dynamic, I'm talking about information that's retrievable from correlating information across time, right? Like an object boundary movement, or changes in lighting, or motion of objects. So now that we've defined what static and dynamic information is, I'm going to go through the approach and how we quantify it. So given a pre-trained model and some video data set that we want to interpret, we're going to sample a video from that data set. Here's a video from something. Then what we're going to do is sample a factor, either static or dynamic. And if we sample static, we're going to perform what's called a static perturbation. So we're going to perturb the static information in the video. And what we do is a form of video stylization. So a recent video stylization approach, which perturbs the static information, but retains the dynamics. If we sample the dynamic factor, we're going to perturb the video dynamically. And what that entails is the same styled video, but temporally shuffled frames. So now we have our dynamic pairs and our static pairs. We're going to feed them through our pre-trained model and output some representation Z. And what we're going to do is actually measure the mutual information between the static and dynamic pairs. Okay? And so the overall metric is going to be via the softmax over the factors, the relative static versus dynamic information that the network captures between those two pairs across the data set. Okay? So now we've defined our metric, we can quantify static and dynamic information in various models. We'll go into the empirical results. So first, we decided to look at action recognition architectures. And we're going to study the most popular data set probably is still Kinetics 400, or some version of Kinetics. And we looked at single-stream 3D CNNs, as well as two-stream 3D CNNs, and recent transformer models. Okay? So what we're measuring here on the y-axis is the number of dynamic channels versus static channels normalized among all of the different blocks or layers of the network. Okay? So static is going to be in red, while dynamic's in blue, and each model has its own marker shape. So what I want you to take away from these results here is that every single model at every single layer is biased towards static information, except for the fast branch of the slow-fast model. So this points to the slow-fast model actually being valid in a mechanism for extracting motion information in that fast stream. So we also looked at a number of different data sets. So we trained models on Kinetics, something v2, and diving 48. So previous work has supposed that diving 48 actually has the least amount of appearance bias because all the backgrounds are basically identical, right? They're all dives, it's all pools and things like that. So we wanted to test if this was true. So what we're going to do is we're going to, for two different models, measure the number of dynamic units contained in the model. So here are the results, and what I want you to draw away from this is that diving 48 and Kinetics are basically the same amount of dynamics encoded in the model. Right? And we were a little confused. We thought diving 48 would have more dynamics, right? So in order to investigate this further, we performed another experiment where we trained the models on shuffled frames, okay? And then what we did is we calculated the relative performance drop from normal frames to shuffled frames. And so you'd expect a dynamically heavy data set would be very difficult to solve if the frames were shuffled, right? And that's what we see with something v2, but in fact, diving 48 and kinetics were quite similar. So the conclusion here is that if we want to evaluate dynamics in video understanding for action recognition models, we should do it on something v2. But looking into the future, right, and we talked about this a bit earlier today, how can we use this as an application or an intervention in our model, right, to make the algorithm better? So beyond explainability, how can we use this as an intervention? Well, we asked two main questions. The first question was, is it actually possible to manipulate the biases of our model, okay? And if it is, the second question we asked is, what is the resulting performance change, right? What is the impact on performance if we can manipulate these biases? So in order to do that, we're going to propose a new type of dropout. So here we have standard dropout, or standard action recognition classification. You have your fully connected layer, and we randomly sample units to mask out to 0. So our static dropout that we proposed, we're going to sample the units to drop out based on the static bias of the unit. So let's go through the approach. So given a video v1, we're going to temporally shuffle the frames to generate a video v2. We pass both of the representations through the model, and now we have, remember, a static pair. So using these representations, we're going to calculate the mutual information for each channel, and then perform a softmax over all the channels to get a multinomial distribution where the probability is relative to the static bias of the channel. We then drop out the units based on that distribution. And the goal here is to debias the model from static information and towards dynamics. So let's see the results. So remember our first question, can we manipulate the biases? So we have two metrics that we're going to analyze to answer that question. One is that relative performance on shuffled frames, and the second is using our metric, the fraction of dynamic to static dimensions, right? And we try a number of different dropout ratios to see if we can actually have a dose-dependent bias manipulation in our model. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. The performance on shuffled frames decreases as the dropout rate increases, and the dynamic bias of the model increases as the dropout rate increases. So yes, we can manipulate the biases of our model. So in terms of the second question, what is the impact on performance? We target a data set called the something else compositional split. It's a split of something v2, where the objects used on the training set are completely disjoint from the objects used for the same actions on the validation set. So there's a reduced amount of object bias in the action manipulations. So again, we have two metrics. One, of course, is the top one accuracy, and the second is the dynamic bias to see if, does the bias correlate with any improvements on performance. Our baselines are no dropout as well as standard dropout, and compared to those baselines, static dropout increases the bias and also has a significant improvement in performance. So yes, we can manipulate the performance as well, and the performance is improved for some dynamically heavy tasks. So in conclusion, we first introduced a new metric for quantifying static and dynamic information in deep neural networks. We use that to interpret and explain architectures as well as data sets. And finally, we used it as an intervention and show that we could actually impact the performance in a positive manner using our metric. So thank you for listening. Come visit our poster to see the rest of the results, and you can find the paper and the project page up on the slide here. Thank you.